Hi, I'm Kevin of Keen Mass Appraisal Consulting. I consider myself to be a racial and social justice advocate. And today I'm here to talk about assessments from the viewpoint of racial and social equity. Now, this is a topic that's been drawing a lot of interest in the assessment community. Some municipalities have already been the targets of studies alleging bias in assessments. I have been exposed to many opinions and a lot of material about this subject. I have found that there is plenty of room for discussion. I hope to present a different perspective, one that looks at bias in assessment not as a social issue, but as a complex systems problem. It's full of statistical and computational biases, human biases, and systemic biases. Now, it is not my intention to contradict or disparage any of the work that has been produced on this subject. I hope to provide some insight and to encourage discussion and further engagement. So simply stated, this is the issue. There is a common perception that many jurisdictions currently overassess or overtax the poor and communities of color. We can't solve a problem if we don't define it properly. Are we asking the right questions? Do we truly understand the nature of the problem? A lot of analysis has been performed. Is this analysis meaningful? How do we define and create meaningful analysis? And lastly, what are the remedial actions and steps that can be taken to correct bias if it is detected? What is equity? Let's start there. The dictionary defines equity as the quality of being fair and impartial, but we need to go a step further. In assessment, we consider equity to be a state wherein a group of properties that share a given set of attributes have similar values for tax purposes. From a racial or social perspective, there should be no discernible systemic bias in the valuation process or in the resulting set of appraisals based on race, ethnicity, religion, income, age, or other demographic stratification. So I'd like to make a distinction between equality and equity. With equality, everyone gets the same thing, whether they need it or not. If we seek to correct an imbalance that creates a disadvantage for a certain group, equality often does not solve the problem. In fact, it often makes the problem measurably worse. Now, with equity, everyone gets what they need so that a common goal or result can be achieved. Now, I believe that the assessor is uniquely positioned to produce equity. From a systems perspective, equality is about process, while equity is about outcome. As assessors, we have access to the best data, possess the best domain knowledge, have the best understanding of the history of valuation in our jurisdictions. Courts, on the other hand, tend to produce equality. So how many times have we heard the phrase equal under the law and witnessed the inequity that results from that approach? For this reason, I suggest that the assessor's office is the best party to act proactively to identify, isolate, and correct systemic bias or anecdotal bias in assessments. So we want in this discussion to stay focused on assessments. There is so much information out there that it is easy to conflate assessments with taxes or assume that bias in local pricing structure is causally related to bias in assessments. So here's some examples. Redlining that's the practice of discriminate lending to exclude neighborhoods that are considered undesirable. Making mortgages unattainable in communities of color or poor communities contributes to the inability of persons in those communities to accumulate wealth. This is an example of the redlining map for the city of Philadelphia. Predatory speculation occurs when cash buyers offer people who may not know the true value of their property easy money for their homes. It frequently occurs in poor communities or communities of color. Restrictive covenants are clauses that are written into deeds to prevent the sale or rental of properties to minorities. They are not uncommon in communities across the nation. Racial deed restrictions became common after 1926 when the U.S. Supreme Court validated their use. An owner who violated them risked forfeiture of their property. Governmental actions have also served to create inequity in housing markets. These actions include using eminent domain to demolish communities of color for public works. This map shows two freeways that were built in Detroit that served to isolate or demolish primarily black-owned business districts and entertainment districts. Other examples include not building sewers or infrastructure to deliver clean water or waste removal to certain communities. There have been recently documented cases of bias in the fee appraisal industry. In more than one example, a black family has received an appraisal, and after removing all evidence, including pictures, artwork, etc., of their ownership, and getting a white family to stand in for them to meet another appraiser, these same families received much higher estimates of value. Now, what do all of these examples have in common? Well, none of them are about assessments. As assessors, we need to stay tightly focused on the issues that involve mass appraisal. We are not typically responsible for the dynamics of the local pricing structure. We do not determine taxes or create tax policy. We do not set tax rates. Our function is to estimate market values. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter why people pay what they pay for housing, only that we estimate values without favoring one group over another. As I struggled to understand this issue, I found it helpful to use a visual aid. In fact, I could not understand the problem until I created a visualization. So here is my visual representation of the problem. There is a general perception that property assessments are biased against communities of color and poor people. It is possible that the perception is the problem, not the underlying truth. In the face of a strong perception, the truth of the matter may become irrelevant. Though assessments can be either biased or unbiased. There are industry benchmarks for the level of assessment and the relative uniformity of assessments. Ideally, predictive values should closely replicate observed sale prices, with little variation in degree to which those values are related to price. Assessments are considered to be unbiased if measures of uniformity are consistent throughout the universe of sales data, and residuals, which is the difference between the predicted price and the observed price, it's a fancy way to say errors, are randomly distributed. Assessments may be considered to be biased if errors are not randomly distributed or can be correlated with specific locations, high or low prices, or shown to clearly favor one subset of properties over another. It is a practical impossibility to achieve a perfectly distributed set of assessments. However, those that fall within recognized industry standards can be considered to be unbiased. Now, your assessments are the result of a valuation process. There are many different valuation processes. Every community, county, or municipality will create a unique valuation process. However, all valuation processes will have certain elements or subsystems in common. These include data collection and gathering, which leads to databases of property data. Sales validation, which determines which sales are indicators of value of similar properties and also captures attributes of properties at the time of sale, and lead to a database of sales data. Sales and property data may be used to create neighborhood or location definitions. These should not be based on demographic data. Some municipalities use census tracts or zip codes to delineate neighborhoods. If so, the results will almost certainly be biased along demographic lines because zip codes and census tracts themselves are rooted in demographics. Modeling is the logic and mathematics that convert sales, income, cost, and property data into predictions of value. For purposes of this discussion, a model is any repeatable process that results in a value prediction. Review and oversight, which includes examining the values produced by the models or by the evaluation process and making corrections and revisions, as well as the resolution of complaints and informal or formal appeals by property owners. The results of the valuation process are applied to all properties, including those that sold and those that did not sell. In Philadelphia, for a given revaluation project, typically between 6 and 8% of the properties were sold, leaving the vast majority of properties in the unsold properties group. Sales are never evenly distributed, so there may be properties that are not directly represented by sales. This leaves plenty of room for assumptions that may lead to errors. One group of 10 sales might represent a group of 300 properties. Another group of 10 sales might represent only 50 properties. The magnitude of errors can be greatly affected by the representative relationship between sold and unsold properties. Now, if assessments are unbiased, the pool of overassessed properties will be relatively small and randomly distributed so that many homeowners in this group may not be aware that they are overassessed. The pool of underassessed homeowners will also be small and randomly distributed. In my experience, many of these homeowners will know that they are underassessed but will not complain. The large group of accurately and fairly assessed homeowners will typically go about their lives without any feeling about their property assessments. The municipality will be satisfied because very few people are complaining. Most assessment offices exist within the political framework of the county or municipality and do not operate in a vacuum. If there is direct political interference in the valuation process, assessments will necessarily be biased. Political interference may be overt or subtle, and may even be benign or well-intentioned. If assessments are biased, there will be larger pools of both over-assessed and under-assessed properties, and the effects will not be randomly distributed. There will be clusters. There will be clear winners and losers. The losers will be unhappy. The winners may still be quite happy, but the municipality or county should be unhappy as well. Now, let's consider for a moment each of these subsystems and processes. Each of them is driven by humans. Humans have biases. There are opportunities for bias to be introduced through any of these subsystems. And even if one of them infects the valuation process with bias, then the resulting assessments may also be biased. So every one of these subsystems or processes must be without bias in order for the assessments to be unbiased. So when we view it from this perspective, we can easily understand how difficult it is to produce a set of truly unbiased assessments. The deck is really stacked against the assessment office. So how do we determine if assessments are biased or unbiased? Well, whether we use the sales approach, cost approach, or income approach, the resulting estimates of value predictions, they're predictions of a sale price. So we typically conduct a ratio study, which is a statistical process that compares the level of assessment and uniformity to observed sale prices across neighborhoods, types of buildings, price levels, or many other ways to stratify properties. A serious limitation is that ratio studies can only be run against the file of sold properties. They tell us little or nothing about the large pool of unsold properties. Also consider that in most ratio studies, each sale carries equal weight, so the degree to which a sale represents a greater or lesser number of unsold properties is not recognized. So against all of this reality, now there comes an outside analyst. And this person is probably an academic, maybe a community activist. But this person has two things that the assessor's office does not have. Number one, they have impeccable credentials, and two, they have an audience. And they are telling the world that assessments are extremely and systemically biased. They come to this conclusion by running a ratio study, just like the assessor's office does. Well, not exactly like the assessor's office. You see, they don't have access to the same data that the assessor's office has. They are using publicly available data, and this will include sales data that has not been vetted to remove transactions that do not meet prescribed tests for being indicators of typical market activity, and are not useful predictors of prices for similar properties. They're also using only current property data, both physical attributes and market values, not data that describes the conditions that were present at the time of sale or the time of valuation. So for example, that file will include a sale from 2018, let's say, that was for a property in poor condition that sold for $100,000. The property has been subsequently rehabbed and has a current value of $200,000. Now this data file is going to show that the property is a rehab with a value of $200,000 and a sale price of $100,000. To them, it looks like the property is significantly overvalued. In the assessor's data file, however, the sale price of $100,000 is for a poor condition property, for which the prediction of value might have been, say, $102,000. So you see the problem? The analysis is correct, but the data is flawed. Additionally, this analyst is not familiar with the dynamics of the local housing market, and therefore does not recognize the noise that is inherent in any market. The entire appraisal industry is predicated on the premise that the value of a property is linked to its attributes, so that the value can be predicted if the attributes of the property are known and be compared to the attributes of other similar properties that have sold. If I know the attributes of a property, I can predict the value. But there are cases where prices are not as dependent on attributes as they are on other factors that may not relate to the property at all. What happens when the relationship between price and attributes is broken? When observed prices are not based on the attributes of the property, variance from predictable prices arises that cannot be explained. Consider how often we see identical properties next door to one another that sell at the same time but at different prices. The difference may be explained simply by the relative negotiating skills of the buyer and seller, something that can never be captured in our data files. Sometimes variance in price may be due to the presence of an attribute that is so unique, like an indoor swimming pool or a roof garden or deck, that would be statistically insignificant. The relationship between price and attributes tends to break down with greater frequency in the low end and high ends of the price spectrum. So a greater percentage of sales in the low and high end price ranges should therefore be invalidated in the sales vetting process. Now this analyst is usually aware of bias in the local housing market. They know about redlining, restrictive deed covenants, predatory speculation, infrastructure problems, and other things that affect the housing structure, and assumes that those biases have a causal connection with assessments. The analyst examines the results of the flawed ratio study by incorporating demographic data into the analysis. Demographic data such as ethnicity, income, age, levels of education should have no place in the valuation process. Considering that much of the noise in the market occurs in communities of color and poor neighborhoods, cross-correlation of ratios with demographic data further distorts the emerging picture. Even so, the assessor's office must be prepared to examine performance through the lenses of demographics if these arguments are to be countered. This can be tricky, as it's so easy to confuse correlation with causality. So all of this converges to create a very strong perception, seemingly based in fact, that assessments are biased. Articles and reports are published and presented to the public. What results are large groups of people who believe that they are subject to unfair treatment by the county or municipality. The municipality is concerned because the very real threat of a class action lawsuit could result in significant loss of revenue. Even worse, the remedy that could be imposed by a court may actually fail to resolve the problem. The cure could be worse than the disease. In addition to the ratio study, there are other meaningful analyses that need to be formed. There is a space where innovation is needed. We need to go beyond traditional analyses and find some new analysis that needs to be performed. We need to look beyond the relationship between sales and market values and consider things like activity levels, representation of unsold properties, comparative market value rates, and other measures of assessment equity and performance. We need to use root cause analysis and other fuzzy tools to ensure that all parties in the discussion are addressing the same issues from a common perspective. Only then can we identify both the presence of bias in the valuation process and trace any observed bias to its source so that it can be remediated. Now, only when I made this diagram was I able to see that I was not addressing the correct question. When presented with a report that assessments in Philadelphia were biased, I went directly to all the elements on the left side of the diagram. That is the valuation process and subsystems, without considering the most important aspects of the discussion. What was generating the perception of bias? How were qualified analysts coming to this conclusion? I had to identify the elements on the right side of the diagram in order to frame a discussion that had any chance of allowing a rational approach to identifying and resolving the issues. So thanks for hanging in there with me, but I think that really helps to illustrate and crystallize the nature of the problem. So one of the things that happens, the entire appraisal industry is predicated on the principle that a property's value can be predicted if attributes of a property are known and can be compared to the attributes of similar properties that have sold. In other words, attributes equal price or value. But what happens when this isn't true? When observed prices are not based on the attributes of the property, this variance from predictable prices arise and it cannot be explained. And this more commonly exists at the low end and high end of the price or value spectrum. The path to equitable assessment starts with a process that limits subjectivity and opportunities to introduce bias, but it also requires the use of methods and techniques that do not consider demographics in the determination of market values. Many jurisdictions use locations that are based on demographics, census tracts and zip codes, or voting districts, and they may even include demographic data such as crime rates, income, ethnicity, educational attainment into the process of determining value. There are also biases in the coding of attributes that can contribute to inequities in assessment. The assessment process should avoid the use of demographic attributes or data at any point in the valuation process. Neither should the assessor rely on legacy information that may be subject to bias, such as redlining maps. The resulting process, if you avoid all of these things, should be resistant to systemic bias, although each valuation subsystem may still be subject to the biases of the humans who interact with the system. So all of these subsystems can contain bias. And again, if any of them do, then your valuation process is going to be biased. So in looking at some of the analysis that gets done, these are some of the most common problems that I find. The analyst is using sales data that is not appropriate for the analysis. They don't have characteristics at time of sale. They haven't thoroughly vetted the sales transactions, so they may be using sales that are not good indicators of value. Characteristics data is not representative of the properties at time of sale. So you have a value, current characteristics, and other characteristics at the time of sale. And that means that that relationship is broken. It should not be relied upon. There's no significant sales validation being conducted. They're using imprecise time trending methods. The ratio study is based on flawed data. They're not recognizing or removing market noise from the analysis. So they will, for example, assume that you should remove 5% of the transactions across the entire spectrum of sales. They're not considering the representation of unsold properties. And frequently they'll run comparisons based on total price or total value. And there's a lot of variance. Even if you walk down a block, there may be variance based on other attributes. So they should normalize their observations by using price per square foot and market value per square foot. And here's the kicker for the assessor. Defense against these allegations is based on the proof of non-existence of bias. So they don't necessarily have to prove that bias actually exists, but you have to prove that it doesn't. And empirically, it's much easier to prove that something does exist than to prove that it doesn't. And that's a tall order for the assessor. Let's talk about sales data. So you have your public record files of unvetted sales, and you have your validated sales file. The assessment office has a lot of functions. One of the first and most principal among them is the promotion of public records that disclose public information relating to the ownership and consideration paid for every parcel in the county. Publicly available data files are structured to support this function. These files typically list only the most recent deed transaction for each parcel, and only the most rudimentary validation, that is coding as a sheriff sale or sales between related parties, nominal considerations, blanket transactions, has been performed. The assessment office also bears responsibility for the mass appraisal of all properties, including a variety of methods to promote fair and equitable market values based on the location and attributes of each parcel. This requires an entirely different type of sales file, one that includes multiple transactions per parcel, and where all have been thoroughly validated to include only transactions that are useful indicators of the value of similar properties and attributes as they existed at the time of sale. So each of these files serves only the purpose for which it was intended, and neither should be used as a substitute for the other. Publicly available sales data should not be used to determine the equity of assessments from any perspective, and yet many analysts use these very files to support the perception of biased assessments. At the minimum, the analyst should use appropriate sales file. The best source of properly vetted and maintained sales data is the assessment office. But if the analyst is alleging misconduct on the part of the assessment office, how much faith will they have in a file that the assessor gives them? Some analysts will use data files from multiple listing services or other sources that are electronically available. However, we also have to recognize that many transactions that occur in disadvantaged communities or communities of color may not be represented by real estate professionals. So therefore, there is an implicit bias in using MLS data. Sales validation consists of two parts. The first is coding transactions as either valid or invalid. and capturing the characteristics of a property at the time that it was sold. The purpose of a robust sales valuation process is to create a pool of sales that are good indicators of the value of similar properties. So this goes way beyond just a simple determination as to whether or not a transaction was arm's length or not. Your sales validation should seek to eliminate sheriff sales, foreclosures, estate sales, bids, sales to predatory speculators, sales between related parties. Unfortunately, sales validation is highly subjective, and it's especially susceptible to human bias. Many counties that rely only on the cost approach may not have created a sales file that meets these criteria. Even if the sales approach is not the primary driver of the valuation process, sales will be used to measure assessment performance. Ratio studies are easily distorted by including transactions where the attributes of a property at the time of valuation are different than the attributes that were present at the time of sale. It's strongly recommended that a well-validated file of transactions that meet these criteria is created and maintained and used to evaluate assessment performance. So what constitutes a good sale? So whether we're conducting ratio studies or estimating values for unsold properties based on sales, the definition of a good sale must include, from the perspective of the property, that it's been exposed to an open market for a reasonable length of time, and that consideration must be expressed as currency. In terms of the parties, both the buyer and seller should be well informed, typically motivated, acting with self-interest. On the buyer's part, they should be using typical financing. The seller should be making no concessions. The parties should not be related, and neither party should be under duress. So the goal of sales validation is to keep all the transactions that are good indicators of the present value of similar properties and to eliminate all of the others. Let's talk a moment about adjusting sales for time. To have sufficient number of transactions to support a reasonable analysis, the analyst most often has to use several years of sales data. Prices must be adjusted for time to normalize data as of a common date. Accurate time trending is a process that requires extensive knowledge of the local markets and submarkets. Within a jurisdiction, there are frequently multiple time trends in play. Some areas or types of property are simply hotter than others. So the problem, many analysts will use consumer price indexes or housing indexes to adjust sales for time. The problem with that is that consumer price indexes include food, clothing, gas, guns, butter, all of which change at different rates and probably not in the same direction or degree as real estate. Housing indexes are often reliable only at regional levels and are not granular enough to trend prices across submarkets. Therefore, use of these generalized indexes is not recommended. Also, using these methods will result in adjustments that are linear and too general to support reliable analysis. So here's as an example, these are the 66-month time trends for single-family properties from different parts of Philadelphia. So you can look at them and see immediately that no two of them are the same, and none of them are linear. So the use of one linear trend for all properties can't possibly yield accurate time trend. And also, like if I was to use a linear trend, I would draw a straight line from the beginning point to the end point. I'd be right at both of those points and wrong everywhere in between. So time trending method is very, very important if you're going to do any kind of analysis as to the performance of real estate assessments. The concept of market noise. Real estate is particularly noisy data for any statistician to work with. Every market has groups of properties for which it is very difficult to predict price or value. Some groups of properties may not be represented by sales data. Data coding may be more difficult, inconsistently performed, or even not available for some groups or types of properties. Disadvantaged communities will have a disproportionate share of transactions that should be invalidated. Data quality and completeness may often be less reliable among these transactions. Sheriff sales, bids, foreclosures, sales to predatory speculators are much more common in the lower end of the price spectrum. Variance in price for unique attributes that are not captured in the data files, such as expensive custom features, is much more common in the high end of the price spectrum. So these kinds of properties must be recognized and either removed from or given special consideration in the analysis. Greater variance should be expected among non-homogeneous housing stock, the kind of stock that's typical in most urban areas. Now, this noise reduction can be achieved through sales validation or data quality validation, but there should never be an expectation that distribution of properties that should not be considered is going to be constant throughout the inventory. So a couple of final points as we're seeking to define our problem. In order for systemic bias to exist, assessments for the disadvantaged class should underperform consistently in contrast to other classes. Anecdotal bias, which is where you'll see it in some places but not others, is not evidence of systemic bias. There may be bias in the local pricing structure, but as long as assessments consistently respond to observed prices, whatever those prices are and whatever's responsible for them being what they are, it doesn't matter why those prices exhibit patterns of bias or discrimination. It does not mean that the assessments will be biased. So moving on into the next phase, conducting meaningful analysis. Understanding that a blind and fair process is producing undesirable bias against one group or in favor of another is the first step in uncovering the causes of such bias. How can we actually determine the degree to which assessments are biased? One way, or our way of proceeding, should be with an attitude of open-minded curiosity. So nothing in this process should come from a punitive or defensive mindset. We want to use analysis to uncover the root causes of bias so that remedial action can be recommended and taken. And we want to be entirely objective throughout the process. If possible, a neutral third party should be used to run the analyses. One of the most insidious forms of bias is confirmation bias, which pretty much means that a person will see exactly what they expect to see. And they'll find data that supports that point of view and ignore everything else. So traditional bias may fall short in uncovering racial and social bias in assessments. Sales ratio studies are an important tool, but they should not be exclusively relied upon. Many properties in disadvantaged communities are not represented by sales, and this can lead to errors in valuation and analysis. You need demographic data for the analysis, but the assessor's office should not be using demographic data, and it should not be part of the evaluation process. And in some cases, the development of sophisticated visualization tools may need to be developed. Use of demographic data is necessary in a meaningful analysis, but the assessment office is not the party who should integrate property and sales data with demographic data. If you're a county or municipality that conforms to USPAP, USPAP prohibits the use of demographic data in appraisals. So what do you look for or demand if you're going to have an outside third party do this analysis? Well, zip codes and census tracts are often too large to use in order to provide the correct, desirable level of granularity. So census data is aggregated by what are called census block groups. They are groups of related census blocks. They're smaller than tracts, but bigger than census blocks. So they're less sensitive to a lot of variation by just simply by removing one observation. So you should use census block groups to provide a nice level of granularity. And you have to understand that demographic data is imperfectly collected and may be misleading. So for instance, in some of the questions, there are no categories for some people. And so what do they answer? So the stratifications that you're using should be as reliable as possible. Also, census data exists as continuous data. It's numeric. And frequently you need to transform it into categorical data in order for it to become useful for analysis. You want to try to make comparisons based on normalized rates, so you should always be looking at price per square foot comparisons or market value per square foot comparisons among similar properties in order to draw a qualified conclusion. Ratio studies. Let's talk about ratio studies. At the top, we have a qualified ratio study using good data versus a ratio study that gets run using publicly available data. Ratio studies are commonly used to examine the relationship between prices and assessed values. So to the degree that the properties that have sold are representative of the properties that have not sold, a ratio study can provide valuable insight into the fairness and equity of all assessments in a jurisdiction. But there is a presumption that the attributes at time of sale are the same as the attributes at time of valuation. Now, when a property's attributes at the time of sale are primarily the same as at the time of valuation, I mean, there can be some difference, but nothing that's really a lot, nothing that's really significant. Well, in that case, there is a relationship between sale price and market value. However, when a property's attributes at the time of sale are different than at the time of valuation, that relationship becomes broken and there's no longer a relationship between price and market value. So what do I mean by that? So you'll see a sale price for a property that was in poor condition. Let's say it's a low sale price for $100,000. And then later on, that property is rehabbed and gets revalued as now it's a rehab property and it's valued now at $200,000. Well, in your ratio study, that sale price of $100,000 and that value of $200,000 is going to look like you severely overvalued that property. And because it's a low sale price, it's going to look like you are severely and possibly systemically overvaluing low-priced properties. So those kinds of transactions have to be identified and removed from the study. And this is in the IAAO standard. Many people that I've seen do ratio studies have neither the capacity nor they just don't take this step of pulling out or disqualifying the sales for the properties that have changed. But it's a necessary step or you're going to get a lot of false positives, false indications through your ratio study. So how useful are ratio studies? Well, you can make the argument that the level of assessment, that's the median ratio between advantaged and disadvantaged communities, is the best objective measure of equity. In other words, if I look at my disadvantaged community and I look at my advantaged communities and the median ratios are the same, that's a pretty good indicator that I have decent equity. The price-related differential or the price-related bias are traditional indicators of vertical equity. So you do want to take a look at those. Dispersion measured by the coefficient of dispersion is less meaningful when your housing stock is not homogeneous. So ratio studies can always give you a good indication of what's happening with the most typical or in the middle of the inventory, but it's much less informative when you get out to the edges or the unusual properties. And ratio studies will tell you nothing about the properties that don't sell. So we're making an assumption that the properties that sell are similar to unsold properties, but this assumption has to be tested. Ratio studies using demographics. So most ratio studies will give you one score for the entire jurisdiction. But you should stratify your ratio studies so you can see where you're doing well and where you're not doing well. So this is an example of running ratio statistics by neighborhood or by various condition codes. And we can see here we're doing very well with new construction and rehabs, above average properties. But when we get down to the poor condition properties, we're doing really poorly. We're overvaluing them. Not by a whole lot, but our uniformity is pretty poor. Our measures of regression are pretty poor. So you want to stratify. This is by various price points. Now, when you do demographics and you create demographic categories, you can use you can look at ratios by those categories. So this is an example of ratios by income class, or by race class, or by a combination of race and income classes. So if I categorize race by 5 groups and income by 5 groups, that's 25 groups, if I use that bivariate designation, that I can measure. It's important to understand that not all properties will be proportionately represented in the ratio study. So in most ratio studies, each transaction carries equal weight. So this figure shows 2 different groups of comparable properties from our Philadelphia file. One group of 301 properties is represented by 17 sales. The other group of 43 property is represented by 22 sales. So in an unweighted study, all 39 sales will carry equal weight, although each of the 17 sales for the first group clearly represent proportionately many more properties than each of the 22 sales from the second group. So having groups of properties that are persistent, which means that the groupings exist in the data at all times, and consistent, which means that no matter who's querying the data, they're going to get the same results, allows for the assigning of weights. So if these groups exist all the time, I can weight the value I can assign different values to each transaction based on the number of properties that it represents. And that's going to allow us to better interpolate performance for the unsold properties. Many properties in disadvantaged communities, or communities that are not typical, aren't represented by sales, which can lead to errors in valuation and or analysis. So here's a group, 49 properties, only 2 sales. Now this is not a low price or value group, but here's a group of 30 properties, no sales data. So if there's no sales for these properties, how do we know that the values are right? We can compare in these other groups, we can compare the price per square foot to the market value per square foot rates and see that, they're pretty close, or they're reasonably close. But when there's no sales, we can't make that comparison. So how do we know if we're getting good results? So we have to be able to go beyond ratio studies to consider representation. And we should consider weighting our ratio studies so that sales that represent more properties can carry greater weight. So by mapping these groups, we can visualize representation. So one of the things that we'd expect to see if we look at where are the below average condition properties and the poor condition properties, we would expect those to correlate with lower income areas. So you can map that. Take all the properties that are in average or below average or poor condition, and let's see where they are, how they lay out against a map of income groups, census block groups by income. Here's another way you can look at it. This is a group, one of the groups that we just looked at in the previous slide of the 300 properties. So this shows you where all of those properties that are considered to be comparable to each other are. Where are they? And the ones that are in red are the ones that sold. I don't know if you can see the difference in the colors in the dots, but you can see where the ones that sold versus the ones that don't. So you can see for this group up here, there were no sales, and that might be problematic. Here's another group of properties where there's less of them, but you can see that they're kind of clustered, and there are some sales in this group and some sales here, but in this group, there are no sales. This shows the distribution of two other groups in which there were no sales. This is our group of 30 properties for which there were no sales, and they're isolated on 2 blocks, no sales. So how do we know if those values are good? But we can at least get a feel by using these kinds of visual tools of how well represented these properties are. So here's a breakdown of representation by groups of similar properties. So we look at them by how many groups there are. Single family, there are in this data set, there are 35,200 groups that represent 422, almost 423,000 properties. There are about 55,000 sales. So the representation percentage of the entire group is about 13%. But if you look at these, look at how much variance there is in the degrees of representation. How many of these groups have only 1 account in them? How many groups have less than 5 accounts? So you can see there's, of these 35,000 groups, about 25,000 of them have fewer than 5 accounts, but it only accounts for 40,000 properties. And they're represented by almost 11,000 sales. So they're selling at twice the activity rate of the typical properties. How many groups have no sales? 20,000 groups, no sales, 59,000 properties. How many have at least 1 sale, at least 3 sales? And then we look at by condition codes, we can look and see what it is. So we're going to expect a rate of 6 to 10% over a 5-year period, but only our average condition properties conform to that. So by doing this kind of analysis, you can get a feel for how well your inventory is represented across various strata. I'm a big fan of building dashboards, and these are interactive visual tools that allow you to visualize relationships, and you don't have to add the data to your CAMA system. So for this project, I created an equity dashboard to visualize assessment performance by census block groups. And I started by categorizing groups by income and by race. I then added sales, assessment, and attribute point data to see patterns by neighborhood delineations and also by census block groups. So we can use our dashboard to visualize how census block groups align with defined neighborhoods. So this is the map of our 5 categories by income, census block groups. And this is a map of our 5 categories based on racial mix. And then if I look at our map, superimpose upon that our map of our neighborhoods, and I'm going to blow this up a little bit, you can see that these boundaries don't coincide. So we can show in this way that our neighborhoods are not being drawn based on demographics, which is a desirable thing. I can also look at my bivariate, or the combination of income and race. I have 25 different groupings, and this is how they are distributed across the city. So now I can take these base maps and I can dump point data on top of them. So this, for instance, is a look at, we divide our market values by class into market value classes. We have, I think, 10 or 11 different classes of market value, and we overlay those on the map by race class. So we can see what the correlations are between market value and race. We do the same thing by income class. I think this is sales by income class. We can look at our ratios to look at our concentrations. So we divide our ratios into 5 categories: severely underassessed, just right, slightly overassessed, severely overassessed. We have 5 groups, and we can plot them and see if there's patterns. Are there places where everybody's overassessed? Are there places where everybody's underassessed? But we can visualize that using a tool like this. Another example in the dashboard is we're looking at sales based on condition codes. So we have our various condition codes color coded, and we put those down on the map, and we can see where are the sales of poor condition properties and vacant properties, where are our new construction, and we can look and identify the patterns. We can look at properties that are below average and poor condition by income class on the map. So we kind of expect to see more of them concentrated in the lower income areas, and we do, but what if we didn't see any of them? That would be an indication that maybe there's a problem with our data gathering. We can do the same thing by race class. This is one that we looked at. We looked at properties by rental class based on overlaid against income. So we have 3 different shaded to the dots: an apartment building, a multifamily, or a single family rental. And we can overlay those on our income class. You can kind of see that in the lower income neighborhoods, there's an awful lot of rental licenses. But you can also see that the concentration of apartment buildings, if you knew that there was a rail line that ran here and a rail line that ran along here, and public subway line that runs along here, you'd see where there's concentrations of large apartment buildings. So these are the recommended analyses that I would use. So statistical measurements and tabular data can help determine if bias exists. Visualizations can help us interpret the statistics to uncover both patterns and the extent of bias, and demonstrate the results in ways that are easy to understand. So the first thing I would recommend in your analysis is that you normalize your observations by price per square foot or market value per square foot instead of price or value. You should stratify your ratio statistics, not just produce one number for the entire jurisdiction, but stratify by neighborhood, condition, price, size, price points, and also by demographics. You need to transform that census data into categories so that ratio statistics by demographics can be run. But I do not recommend that the assessor's office is the party to do this. You need to bring in a third party to run those analyses, because otherwise it's difficult to say that you're not incorporating those demographics into your evaluation process. You want to examine the relationships between assessment data and demographics. You want to identify groups of properties that are not represented. You want to compare the distribution of rentals across community types. You want to compare market value rates to sale price rates between as well as within groups of comparable properties. And you want to run these kind of fuzzy root cause analysis to source perceived bias. And what do I mean by that? So root cause analysis are things like asking the question why a bunch of different times, each one getting you a little deeper and deeper and deeper until you can figure out where's the perception of something coming from. They're not data driven, they are subjective, where you're looking to uncover what people believe are the causal connections. So once we've conducted meaningful analysis, we're sufficiently informed, and now we're ready to move on to the real work, which is correction or remediation of any biases that have been identified. So if statistical visualizations or root cause analysis indicate that bias is present, what can be done to address or correct the problem? So the answer is going to be dependent on the extent of the indicated bias. Is it systemic, that appears everywhere, or is it anecdotal, that only appears sporadically? And what are the causes or the sources of bias? So I recommend that the remediation process should start with a careful deconstruction of the entire valuation process and all of the subsystems to identify possible sources of bias. So I'm going to give some examples of what you might find when you look into these various subsystems. And these examples aren't going to be exhaustive, but they are useful as guidelines. So you want to look at your data collection and gathering, your sales validation operation, how your neighborhoods are defined, what the review and oversight process is, and what your modeling looks like. Some of these will be statistical or computational biases that can be directly determined. Some of what you're going to uncover here is the human biases of the people who are interacting with these systems, and you may find systemic bias. Data coding risks. So even when your assessments are based on objectively observed attributes of properties and you're using the most demographically agnostic processes possible, it's still possible for the biases of those who collect and enter the underlying data to introduce bias into the process. So some attributes that are significant determinants of value are subjective in nature. They're in the eye of the beholder. Achieving consistently in the application of, say, quality codes, condition codes, delineation of neighborhood locations is essential in minimizing inequities in the evaluation process. Some attributes for neighborhoods may not have adequate representation. And when that happens, you're going to have to make presumptions of comparability, and those may not always be appropriate. So here's an example of a data coding risk, condition of improvement. This is a pretty common one, and I think one of the greatest sources of inequity. So if you have a data collector who's working in a neighborhood where most of the properties have a lot of deferred maintenance, and they should be coded as below average or poor, because there's a preponderance of them, that person might code those properties as average. So here's coefficients from a valuation model. And you can see that below average condition properties should be valued at about 38% less than those in average conditions. This is a log, so you have to convert it. But it's about a 38% reduction compared to average condition properties. So none of the properties that are miscoded as average. So you've got all these below average properties, they're all being miscoded as average. So none of them are going to get the appropriate downward adjustment, which is going to result in all of them being overvalued. So even though this data collector had no intention of creating inequity, they just thought they were describing something. But that's exactly what's happened. Here's another example of a risk in your sales validation operation. Now, we said that sales validation is necessarily subjective and it's especially susceptible to human bias. So you have to look at what information is being used to validate sales and capture characteristics at time of sale. How reliable is the sales data? You want to look at the ratios between valid and invalid sales by neighborhood, across price points, and demographic categories to understand, are you throwing too many sales out in one strata versus another? You should have a party that's not the original validator examine the validation codes and review the validation decisions to see if there are patterns of bias. Believe it or not, models can be built in such a way that the code itself contains bias. So, models are theoretically just math, and you feed them data and something comes out. But the code itself can contain bias. Models should not be built to produce an expected result. So if you have a model who says, well, I know what's important before I even build or test this model, they're going to be building their biases into the model. Some of the model code, if we have something that's not really represented, we have to make some judgment calls. We may not be making the correct transformations, correct judgment calls. You want to avoid the use of demographic attributes in valuation models, and you need to examine the model code, and you want to look at what are the untested assumptions that are being made. Here's an example of a model coding risk using building square footage. So building square footage appears in almost every valuation model. It's an important attribute. And it always has to be transformed. You can't just take the number out of the database and stick it in the model. It has to be transformed into an attribute in some way. And there's a lot of different ways to transform building square footage. I've used probably 6 or 8 of them in my career. I know of at least a dozen. But each of them has advantages and disadvantages that could either make them the best one to use or the worst one to use. And it all depends on your local market dynamics. So if you choose one over the others, it could introduce bias for or against smaller or larger properties. So let's say I used a linear rate per square foot as my adjustment. Well, at the higher end, on larger properties, the contributory value of square footage tends to drop off, so that as size increases, the contributory effect of each square foot decreases. Well, if I use a linear transformation, I'm going to be building in a bias against my larger properties. The same could be true with some transformations that are going to build in bias against smaller properties. So you have to be very careful in selecting the correct transformations. Now, in neither case would it be my goal to introduce bias, but because of the way that I transform that data, it could be happening anyway. Neighborhoods. So neighborhoods should be areas within which parcels that have similar characteristics will sell for similar prices. Not necessary for all properties in a neighborhood to be similar. Neighborhoods should be created that are agnostic to who lives in or owns the properties, and they should be frequently updated to reflect changes in the market. So this is a screenshot from a dashboard that I put together that it analyzes, it's useful for analyzing neighborhood performance. But by this definition, there's no such thing as a poor neighborhood or a community of color. All you're looking at is characteristics of parcels. It has nothing to do with the people. But if you're using zip codes or census tracts, they are created based on demographics. If you are using them to define your neighborhoods, you are baking social or racial bias into your valuation process. So I would say that if you're a jurisdiction that uses census tracts or zip codes to define locations, you should stop doing that. Another place where bias can easily get into the process is in value review. So reviewing values, this is when you review the values that are produced by the models. It is a common entry point for human bias. So the review process includes revaluation projections from the models, informal reviews, and taxpayer appeals. All of these are places where bias can get into the process. For instance, some reviewers will reduce values or raise values in a review for a variety of reasons. Taken as a whole, the body of review work may be inconsistent and can easily reflect the bias of the reviewer. Automatic loser, political interference. Well, many assessment offices exist as part of a political organization. In fact, I don't know any that don't. The assessor is not always free to follow the best objective standards and practices. Political intervention or interference is not necessarily ill-intentioned, so it ranges from everything from the people getting together in a back room and saying you can raise values in this area but don't raise them over here. But it could be well-intentioned. The way that you're limiting increases in certain areas to prevent regressivity. There are decisions that get made by politicians that may not be ill-intentioned, but may still produce undesirable outcomes, or often the unintended consequences of other decisions. So if you have, for instance, abatements for new construction, it's possible that you can create an entire class of buyer who never pays property tax. Every time their abatement's about to expire, they go and they buy another new house. And you can create an entire class of people who are fairly wealthy who never pay their fair share in property taxes. So that would be an undesirable consequence of something that's generally considered to be beneficial in most jurisdictions. But if your analysis demonstrates that there are other forces in play, you're going to lose the bias argument by definition. So what do you do about that? Because you can't keep politicians from intervening. But if there's foreknowledge that intervention is discoverable, it can help prevent or even eliminate presence. So it is possible that you're in a legacy system where city council people can demand that you either don't raise values in certain areas, or that you, after you've done your revaluation, that you reduce values in certain areas. Understanding that that kind of activity is discoverable can help prevent that from happening. So if they know that you can catch them, they may make different decisions. But it's impossible. It's a practical impossibility to have a system that's entirely free of political interference. So these are the suggested actions that I make for assessment offices. Number one, you need to share your data files with independent analysts and auditors. Otherwise, they're going to use publicly available files, which include unvetted sales, out-of-sync property data. They're going to come to the wrong conclusions. So don't let them do that. Give them good inventory data. Give them good, properly vetted sales data. You want to use appropriate data when you're conducting ratio studies, and you want to create effective measures for unsold or unrepresented properties. While you should avoid using demographic data, it's useful for analysis purposes. One thing that you want to do is you want to look at all of your subsystems in the valuation process to identify and eliminate sources of this systemic bias. This could be training, it could be writing up standard procedure manuals, it could be changing the way that data is stored and collected in the CAMA system. You want to try eliminate or at least limit external interference in the evaluation process. So if you do find that you have bias, what are the remedies? Well, one of the easy ones is to retrain your staff to collect and manage the data more objectively. You want to invest in improving sales validation. You want to avoid the use of demographic attributes in your evaluation process. You want to redefine your neighborhoods to be racially and socially agnostic. You want to revise the way that data is coded and stored in the CAMA system in some cases. And then having done all that, the best remedy is conduct a full revaluation. Now, that may be out of scope for many of us. Maybe you can conduct a targeted revaluation where you identify the areas that are furthest away or underperforming, and you just do a revaluation there to correct inequities. Or you could wait for a court order to come down. And that's not recommended because you're gonna fix this problem much better than any court ever can. So you really should try to do it before they send down a court order. So in conclusion, how do we make everybody happy? The city, the undervalued people, the people who are valued correctly, the people who are overvalued. Well, number one, you want to be proactive, not reactive. One of the best pieces of advice I ever heard was that if you're doing a revaluation project, you want to start by taking control of the story. You want to act before people tell you that you have to act. Be proactive. If possible, you want to commission a neutral third party to run the analysis. You want to practice transparency. Be prepared to share your data. Be prepared to share your findings. If you do find bias, you want to create a comprehensive plan to limit or eliminate bias. And you want to run follow-up studies to document your progress. Thank you very much for hanging in with me on this long presentation. I hope that this information has been useful to you in terms of understanding how you might have bias in your jurisdiction and how you can find it and maybe eliminate it. Thank you very much. Bye for now.